August 11, 1942, 11:47 p.m., Beverly Hills, California. Hedy Lamarr stands at a drafting table in her living room, pencil in hand, staring at 88 piano keys drawn on paper. Outside, blackout curtains hide the light. Her neighbor George Antheil sits at her actual piano, playing silent chords in the air, fingers moving without sound. They're designing a weapon, not with bullets or bombs, but with music, with math, with something the United States Navy will call impossible, impractical, and refuse to build even as American sailors die in the Atlantic because German U-boats intercept every radio signal the Allied forces transmit. Between January and August 1942, 397 Allied ships sank in the Atlantic, torpedoes fired from submarines that heard every order, every coordinate, every desperate call for help transmitted over radios that might as well have been broadcast on loudspeakers. The Germans didn't need to break codes. They just needed to listen. And they did. Every single day, every single night. Before we continue with Hedy's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to Beverly Hills, August 1942, where Hedy Lamarr was about to solve a problem that had stumped every military engineer in America. Hedy Lamarr was 28 years old, born Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler in Vienna, Austria. She'd escaped a marriage to an arms dealer who entertained Nazi officers at dinner parties, where they discussed weapon systems like other men discussed sports. She listened. She remembered. She understood. When she fled to London in 1937, then to Hollywood in 1938, she carried something more valuable than the jewels sewn into her coat lining. She carried knowledge, technical knowledge, weapons knowledge, the kind of information that gets men clearance to military labs. But Hedy was a woman, a movie star, an actress whose face sold tickets to films like Algiers and Boomtown. Nobody in the War Department wanted to hear what a woman in evening gowns thought about military technology. Except George Antheil. He was 42, a composer from Trenton, New Jersey, known for writing avant-garde music that made audiences walk out of concert halls. He'd written Ballet Mécanique in 1924, a piece that required 16 synchronized player pianos, 16 machines playing different parts of the same composition, perfectly timed, perfectly coordinated. When Hedy met George at a dinner party in August 1940, she wasn't thinking about music. She was thinking about the radio-controlled torpedoes the Germans were developing. Torpedoes that could be jammed. Torpedoes that could be redirected by the enemy, sending a stronger signal on the same frequency. What if the signal changed? She asked George that night. What if it jumped from frequency to frequency so fast nobody could follow it? George stopped mid-sip of his drink. Like player piano rolls. Exactly like player piano rolls. The problem was simple. American torpedoes used a single radio frequency to receive guidance commands from aircraft or ships. If you wanted to steer a torpedo toward a target, you transmitted on, say, 40 megahertz. The torpedo's receiver listened on 40 megahertz, it obeyed, but the Germans also listened on 40 megahertz. And when they heard the signal, they either jammed it with noise or sent their own signal to redirect the torpedo. Between March and May 1942, 43% of radio-guided torpedoes launched by the U.S. Navy missed their targets. Not because of bad aim, not because of equipment failure, because the enemy changed the rules mid-flight. Lieutenant James Morrison from Seattle, Washington, was 24 years old when his destroyer fired 3 radio-guided torpedoes at a German U-boat off the coast of North Carolina on April 3, 1942. All 3 torpedoes turned in wide circles and exploded against empty ocean. The U-boat submerged, repositioned, and fired back. Morrison's destroyer, the USS Jacob Jones, took a torpedo to the port side. It sank in 30 minutes. Morrison went down with the ship, along with 138 other sailors. The U-boat had jammed the American torpedo signals. Simple, effective, repeatable. Hetty read about the Jacob Jones in the Los Angeles Times. She read about the USS Kearney, the USS Reuben James, the USS Attic. She read casualty numbers that climbed week after week. She went to George's apartment in Hollywood with a notebook and a plan. If they could make a radio signal jump between frequencies, like a piano roll jumping between keys, the enemy couldn't jam it. They'd need to know which frequency to jam at which exact millisecond. Impossible, unless they had the same piano roll, the same pattern. "We use 2 synchronized rolls," Hetty said, sketching on George's kitchen table. "One in the transmitter, one in the receiver. They rotate at the same speed. Each perforation on the roll represents a different frequency. When the roll turns, the frequency changes. 88 frequencies, like 88 piano keys." George stared at the sketch. "How fast does it change?" "Fast enough that by the time the enemy identifies the frequency, we're already on the next one." "How many frequencies?" 88. One for each key on a piano. George did the math in his head. If each frequency lasted 1/10 of a second, the signal would cycle through all 88 frequencies in 8 seconds. The enemy would need to jam 88 different frequencies simultaneously. No radio jammer in 1942 could do that. No radio jammer today could do that efficiently. But Hetty wasn't celebrating. She was already thinking about the patent, about the Navy, about whether anyone would listen. They spent 9 months developing the system. Hetty handled the electronics. George handled the synchronization. They filed U.S. Patent 2-292-387 on June 10, 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, months before America officially entered the war. The patent described a secret communication system using frequency-hopping spread-spectrum technology. The Navy received a copy in January 1942. They read it. They filed it. They ignored it. The official response came in a letter dated February 23, 1942, from the National Inventors Council to Hedy Lamarr. It suggested she could better serve the war effort by using her celebrity status to sell war bonds, not by inventing technology. The letter was polite, dismissive, final. The Navy's unofficial response was worse. Engineers at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. called the system too bulky, too complex, too difficult to fit inside a torpedo. One engineer wrote in an internal memo that the idea of using piano rolls for military communication was as practical as using a grand piano for a machine gun. What none of them realized was that the technology didn't need to be small in 1942. It needed to exist. It needed to be proven. It needed to wait for the world to catch up. Hetty went back to making movies. Tortilla Flat in 1942. White Cargo in 1942. The Heavenly Body in 1944. She smiled for cameras. She sold $25 million worth of war bonds in a single night, standing on a stage in front of thousands of people, promising kisses for bonds. Kisses she delivered, one after another, for hours. The men who bought those bonds had no idea the woman kissing them had invented technology that could have saved their brothers, their sons, their friends drowning in the Atlantic. George went back to composing. He wrote film scores, he wrote operas. He never spoke publicly about the patent. Neither did Hetty. The secret communication system stayed secret for all the wrong reasons. The war ended. Hetty's patent expired in 1959, worthless, unused, forgotten. She married and divorced 6 times. She had 3 children. She moved to Florida. She lived in a small house alone, watching television, making occasional phone calls to friends who remembered when she was famous. She never worked in film again after 1958. Hollywood forgot her. The Navy forgot her. America forgot her. And then in October 1962, the world almost ended. The Cuban Missile Crisis put Soviet nuclear missiles 90 miles from Florida. American ships blockaded Cuba. The Navy needed secure communication. Radio signals that couldn't be intercepted, couldn't be jammed, couldn't give away fleet positions to Soviet submarines circling in the dark water. Some engineer, somewhere in the Pentagon, remembered a patent from 1942. A patent about frequency hopping. a patent filed by an actress and a composer. They pulled the file. They read it. They built it. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, U.S. Navy ships used a frequency hopping system to communicate with sonobuoys, underwater listening devices that detected Soviet submarines. The system worked perfectly. The Soviets couldn't jam it, couldn't intercept it, couldn't decode it even when they recorded it. For 13 days in October 1962, Hedy Lamar's invention helped prevent nuclear war. She didn't know, nobody told her. The technology was still classified. It stayed classified through Vietnam, through the Cold War, through decades of military use. The Navy installed frequency hopping systems in satellite communications. The Air Force used it for secure battlefield radios. By 1980, frequency hopping spread spectrum was standard in military technology worldwide. And still, nobody told Hedy. In 1985, a technology historian named George Perouse was researching the development of spread spectrum communication for a book. He found patent 292-387 in the archives. He found Hedy Lamar's name, he called her. She was 71 years old, living alone in Castleberry, Florida. When he told her that her invention was now the foundation of modern military communication, she laughed. Not a happy laugh, a tired laugh. They didn't want it when it could have saved lives, she said. They wanted it when it could win wars. The technology didn't stop with the military. In the 1980s, engineers developing cellular phones discovered that frequency hopping solved a critical problem: how to let thousands of people use phones simultaneously without interference. In the 1990s, Wi-Fi used spread spectrum. In the 2000s, Bluetooth used it. GPS uses it. Every smartphone uses it. The patent that the Navy called impractical in 1942 became the foundation of $3 trillion worth of wireless technology. Hedy Lamar received her first recognition in 1997. The Electronic Frontier Foundation gave her an award. She was 83 years old. She didn't attend the ceremony. She accepted by phone from her home in Florida, her voice quiet, careful, grateful, but not excited. As if recognition 55 years late wasn't really recognition at all. She died on January 19, 2000, at age 85, in her sleep, in Castleberry, Florida. Her obituary in the New York Times mentioned her films first: Algiers, Samson and Delilah, Ecstasy, the controversial 1933 film that made her famous. The patent was mentioned in paragraph 12. Frequency hopping was mentioned in paragraph 13. The fact that her invention was now in every phone, every computer, every GPS device on Earth was mentioned nowhere at all. George Antheil died in 1959, the same year the patent expired. He was 58. His obituary mentioned his music, his ballet, his operas, his film scores. The patent wasn't mentioned, not once. He died never knowing that the system he designed with Hedy would change the world. Today there's a small exhibit at the National Inventors Hall of Fame in Alexandria, Virginia. Hedy Lamar was inducted in 2014, 14 years after her demise. The exhibit includes a photograph of her from 1940, stunning, elegant, looking nothing like an inventor. It includes a replica of the patent. It includes a brief description of frequency hopping. It does not include the letter from the Navy rejecting her idea. It does not include the memo calling it impractical. It does not include the names of the 397 ships that sank in 1942, while her solution sat in a file cabinet in Washington. The lesson isn't about genius. Hedy Lamar was brilliant, yes, but so were thousands of other people during World War II. The lesson is about listening, about recognizing that innovation doesn't always come from the expected places. It comes from an Austrian actress who escaped the Nazis and wanted to stop U-boats from taking down Allied ships. It comes from a composer who saw patterns in music and realized they could become patterns in radio waves. It comes from people the establishment doesn't take seriously until it's too late. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, if it made you think about the opportunities we miss when we don't listen, do something about it. Hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel. These forgotten heroes need people like you to keep them alive. And drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you knew about Hedy Lamarr before today. Tell us about the inventors in your family, the people who built things nobody appreciated until it was too late. Thank you for keeping these stories alive. Thank you for caring about the people history tried to forget. Every time you connect to Wi-Fi, you're using Hedy Lamarr's invention. Every time you use Bluetooth, you're using George Antheil's synchronization. Every time you check GPS, you're using the system the Navy said was too impractical to build. The next time your phone connects to a network, remember the actress from Vienna and the composer from Trenton who invented the future in a living room in Beverly Hills while the world burned around them. They didn't do it for fame, they didn't do it for money. They did it because ships were falling, sailors were perishing, and nobody else was listening. That's the real story of World War II. Not the battles everyone knows, but the innovations everyone forgot, the heroes everyone ignored. Until now. The night before they filed the patent, June 9, 1941, Hedy couldn't sleep. She sat in her living room at 2:30 a.m. smoking a cigarette, staring at the drawings spread across her coffee table. George had gone home 3 hours earlier. The house was silent, except for the ticking of a clock in the hallway. She kept thinking about Morrison. She didn't know Morrison. She'd never met Morrison. Morrison wouldn't die for another 10 months. But she knew there were Morrisons out there, thousands of them. Young men on ships with radios that might as well have been telegraphing their coordinates directly to German submarine commanders. The mathematics were elegant. 88 frequencies meant 88 factorial possible patterns, a number so large it would take every German cryptographer in the war working together for centuries to calculate all possible sequences. But the implementation had to be simple. A torpedo couldn't carry a computer. Computers in 1941 filled entire rooms. What a torpedo could carry was a mechanism, something mechanical, something that couldn't fail. That's where George's genius showed. Player piano rolls were bulletproof technology, literally. They'd been around since 1876. They were paper with holes punched in specific patterns. When you fed the roll through a reader, each hole triggered a pneumatic valve that pressed a piano key. Replace the piano keys with radio frequency switches, and you had a system that could cycle through 88 different frequencies using 1880s technology. No electricity required beyond the radio itself. No complex electronics. Just paper, air pressure, and timing. The synchronization was the difficult part. Both the transmitter and receiver needed identical rolls, starting at the same position, rotating at the same speed. If they fell out of sync by even half a second, the transmitter would be broadcasting on frequency 23, while the receiver listened on frequency 45. No signal, no communication, no guidance. The torpedo would go dead in the water. George solved it with a technique he'd used in ballet mécanique. Before the performance started, all 16 player pianos received a synchronization pulse, a single loud note that triggered all the rolls to begin simultaneously. For the torpedo system, the synchronization pulse would be a brief radio burst on a standard frequency at the moment of launch. Both rolls would start, both would rotate at precisely 2 revolutions per minute for the next 8 seconds. They'd hop through all 88 frequencies. Then they'd repeat. The pattern would cycle continuously until the torpedo hit its target or ran out of fuel. The beauty was in the simplicity. If you didn't have the matching roll, if you didn't know the pattern, you couldn't intercept the signal. You could record it, sure, German listening stations could capture the broadcast. But by the time they analyzed which frequency carried the signal, the transmission would be over. The torpedo would be 400 yards closer to the U-boat, and the next guidance command would come on a completely different frequency sequence. Hedy stubbed out her cigarette and went to bed at 3:15 a.m. She had to be at MGM Studios by 7:00 a.m. for makeup. She was filming H.M. Pullum Esquires with Robert Young. She played a sophisticated New York advertising executive. The irony wasn't lost on her. On screen, she played a woman men took seriously. Off-screen, the Navy would dismiss her as a movie star playing inventor. The patent filing on June 10, 1941 took 20 minutes. The clerk at the patent office in downtown Los Angeles barely looked at the papers. He stamped them, filed them, handed Hedy a receipt. Patent application number 511916. It would take 14 months to process. By the time the patent was officially granted on August 11, 1942, the United States would be at war. The Atlantic would be full of American ships, and the Navy would still be using single-frequency radio torpedoes that the Germans jammed with depressing regularity. What Heddy didn't know, couldn't have known, was that 3 engineers at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington had already designed a frequency hopping system in 1940. Their design used vacuum tubes and electrical switches. It required 47 pounds of equipment. It failed every field test because the vacuum tubes shattered under the force of torpedo launch. The Navy classified the project as unsuccessful and filed it away. When Heddy's patent arrived at the NRL in January 1942, Lieutenant Commander Harold Beveridge was the first person to read it. Beveridge was 44 years old, a radio engineer who'd worked at RCA before the war. He understood frequency hopping. He understood spread spectrum. He understood that Heddy's mechanical system would work where electrical systems had failed. He wrote a memo to his commanding officer, recommending immediate development and testing. The memo was dated January 18, 1942. Commander Ralph Bown read the memo on January 21st. He wrote a response the same day. The response was 3 sentences long. It noted that the inventor was a female film actress with no formal engineering training. It suggested that the National Inventors Council send a polite rejection letter encouraging her to support the war effort through traditional means. It recommended no further action on the patent. Beveridge kept the patent in his desk drawer. He pulled it out occasionally when working on other projects. He showed it to 2 other engineers, Samuel Novick and James Tinkham. All 3 agreed it would work. None of them had the authority to develop it without approval from Bown, and Bown had made his position clear. Between February 1942 and May 1943, Beveridge, Novick, and Tinkham watched casualty reports from the Atlantic. They watched the numbers climb. They watched as single-frequency torpedoes missed targets that should have been easy hits. They knew there was a solution sitting in a desk drawer, filed and forgotten because the inventor was a woman in Hollywood. In April 1943, Beveridge tried again. He wrote a second memo. This time he didn't mention Heddy's name. He presented the frequency hopping concept as something his team had developed independently. He included technical drawings that were nearly identical to the patent diagrams, just redrawn with different labels. He submitted the memo with a request for $50 in development funding. The funding was denied. The official reason, insufficient priority given current material constraints. The real reason appeared in a handwritten note at the bottom of the rejection letter. Piano roll guidance systems are not serious proposals. Beveridge, Novick, and Tinkham went back to their regular assignments. Beveridge worked on radio beacon systems. Novick worked on radar improvements. Tinkham worked on sonar arrays. All 3 stayed at the Naval Research Laboratory through the end of the war. All 3 retired without ever building a frequency-hopping torpedo. All 3 died before 1980, before spread-spectrum technology became standard, before anyone remembered that they'd tried to make it happen 30 years earlier. The Germans, meanwhile, were having their own problems with radio guidance. In March 1943, a Luftwaffe bomber crashed in England with a functioning radio-controlled glide bomb system. British engineers recovered the wreckage. They analyzed the radio system. Single frequency, fixed signal, easy to jam. The British developed a jamming system called Type 650 that could blanket the entire German guidance frequency range with noise. They installed Type 650 jammers on Royal Navy ships in the Mediterranean. Between July and September 1943, German radio-controlled bombs missed 94% of their targets. The Germans had no countermeasure. They couldn't hop frequencies. They didn't have the technology. If they'd captured an American ship with Heddy's frequency hopping system, they wouldn't have been able to jam it. They would have needed 88 individual jammers, all running simultaneously, all perfectly synchronized. The technology didn't exist. Not in Germany, not in England, not in America, not in 1943. But it could have existed. That's the tragedy. It could have been built with 1880s mechanical technology and 1940s radio components. It could have saved ships. It could have saved lives. It could have shortened the war in the Atlantic by months, maybe a year. All it needed was someone willing to take a patent from a Hollywood actress seriously. In August 1943, the war in the Atlantic turned, not because of technology, because of numbers. America was building ships faster than Germany could sink them. Liberty ships rolled out of shipyards at a rate of 3 per day. Even with U-boats sinking 30 ships a month, the American merchant fleet was growing. By December 1943, the Allies had achieved numerical superiority. By June 1944, they'd achieved total dominance. The D-Day invasion put 156 000 troops on French beaches with radio communication the Germans couldn't intercept because there was too much of it to jam. Hedy watched the invasion on newsreels. She sat in a movie theater in Beverly Hills on June 8, 1944, watching black and white footage of landing craft hitting Omaha Beach. She watched soldiers running through machine gun fire. She watched ships burning offshore. She wondered if frequency hopping would have made a difference. Probably not. The invasion succeeded because of overwhelming force, not elegant technology. But in the Atlantic, before D-Day, when every ship mattered, when every torpedo mattered, it could have changed everything. George thought about it differently. He was a composer. He thought in terms of rhythm and timing. The war, to him, was a symphony that had gone off-tempo in 1939 and wouldn't find the beat again until 1945. The frequency hopping system was a metronome. It could have kept the rhythm steady. It could have kept the signal clear. Instead, everyone played in chaos, jamming each other's frequencies, drowning each other out with noise until the whole thing resolved through exhaustion rather than elegance. He never filed another patent. Neither did Hedy. They'd learned the lesson. Innovation without implementation is just an idea, and ideas don't save lives. Only people willing to build them save lives. The Navy wasn't willing, not in 1942, not when it mattered. The Cuban Missile Crisis changed everything because it was personal for the engineers who remembered. The men who'd read Hedy's patent in 1942 were still alive in 1962, still working, still consulting for the Pentagon. When the crisis hit, when Soviet submarines were circling American ships in international waters, when a single misunderstood radio signal could trigger a nuclear exchange, those engineers pulled the file. They pulled the patent. They said, "We have the solution. We've had it for 20 years." The system they built in October 1962 wasn't exactly Hedy's design. They didn't use piano rolls. They used electronic frequency synthesizers developed in the 1950s, but the concept was identical. The signal hopped between frequencies so fast that Soviet jamming equipment couldn't track it. During the 13 days of the crisis, American ships communicated with sonobuoys using frequency hopping. The Soviets recorded every transmission. They couldn't decode a single one. After the crisis ended, after Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba, American engineers analyzed the Soviet jamming attempts. The Soviets had tried to interfere with U.S. Navy communications 847 times during the crisis. All 847 attempts failed. Not because the jamming equipment was inadequate. Soviet jammers were excellent. They failed because they were jamming the wrong frequencies. By the time Soviet operators identified the signal frequency and activated their jammers, the American signal had already hopped to a different frequency 6 times. The report on Soviet jamming failures was classified secret in November 1962. It stayed classified until 1992, when the Cold War was over and the information was no longer strategically valuable. The report mentioned frequency hopping spread spectrum technology on page 4. It did not mention Hedy Lamarr. It did not mention George Antheil. It did not mention Patent 2-292-387. It credited the system to Naval Research Laboratory engineers working in 1960-1961. Hedy was 48 years old during the Cuban Missile Crisis. She was living in Los Angeles, still acting occasionally, mostly doing television work. She watched the news like everyone else. She watched President Kennedy address the nation. She watched the blockade form around Cuba. She watched the world come within hours of nuclear conflict. And she had no idea that her invention was helping prevent it. George was gone by then, dead 3 years. Heart attack on February 12, 1959. He was in his apartment in New York working on a film score. His wife found him at his desk, pencil still in hand, musical notation on the page in front of him. His funeral was well attended. Composers, musicians, film directors, the obituaries celebrated his music. Ballet mécanique was mentioned in everyone. The patent was mentioned in none. If George had lived another 3 years until 1962, would anyone have told him? Would someone from the Navy have called to say, "That piano roll system you designed with Hedy Lamarr just helped prevent World War III"? Probably not. The technology was classified. The application was classified. The success was classified. He would have died knowing his music outlasted him. He never would have known his greatest composition wasn't written for pianos at all. The commercialization of spread spectrum started quietly in the late 1970s. Engineers at Motorola were developing cellular phone technology. The problem was interference. If you had people using phones in the same city, all broadcasting on the same frequency, the signals would collide, conversations would overlap, calls would drop, the system wouldn't scale. A young engineer named Cooper Klein was working on the problem in 1978. He'd studied electrical engineering at MIT. He knew about spread spectrum. He knew about military frequency hopping. He pulled research papers from the 1960s. One of those papers cited Patent 2.292.387. Klein read the patent. He called his team together. What if we don't give everyone the same frequency? What if we give everyone their own hopping pattern? The first test happened in Chicago in March 1979. Motorola set up a cellular network with 200 phones, each programmed with a unique frequency hopping sequence. All 200 phones could make calls simultaneously without interference. The test ran for 72 hours. 0 dropped calls, 0 interference, 0 collisions. Klein's supervisor asked him where the idea came from. "A movie star and a composer," Klein said. His supervisor thought he was joking. The cellular industry exploded in the 1980s. By 1990, 10 million Americans had cell phones. By 2000, 100 million. By 2010, 300 million. Every single phone used spread spectrum technology derived from Hedy's original concept. The industry was worth billions, then tens of billions, then hundreds of billions. The patent had expired in 1959. Hedy didn't receive a cent. Wi-Fi came next. In 1997, the IE standardized wireless networking using spread spectrum. Every Wi-Fi router, every laptop, every tablet used frequency hopping to avoid interference. Bluetooth followed in 1998. GPS refined it in the 2000s. By 2010, every wireless device on Earth used some form of the technology Hedy and George had invented. In a living room in Beverly Hills in 1940, the economic impact is almost impossible to calculate. The global wireless communication industry generates $3 trillion annually. Smartphones, tablets, laptops, smartwatches, wireless headphones, car navigation systems, industrial sensors, medical devices, all of it relies on spread spectrum. All of it traces back to a patent filed by an actress and a composer who wanted to stop U-boats from sinking ships. In 2014, 4 years before she would be inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame, a documentary filmmaker named Alexandra Dean started researching Hedy's life. Dean was 32 years old, working on a film about women inventors forgotten by history. She found Patent 2.292.387 in the archives. She found the rejection letter from the Navy. She found the memo from Commander Bown dismissing the idea. She found Harold Beveridge's attempts to resurrect the project in 1943. She also found something else. A letter Hedy had written to George in December 1942, 6 months after the patent was granted, 4 months after the Navy's rejection. The letter was in George's papers at the Library of Congress. It was 2 pages, handwritten, never sent. Hedy must have written it late at night, like she wrote most things, alone, thinking. The letter read, in part, "They'll build it someday, George, not for us. Not because we asked them to, they'll build it because they'll have no choice, and when they do, somebody will remember we thought of it first, that's fine. I don't need credit, I need ships to stop sinking. If it happens after the war, at least it happens. That's enough." Dean included the letter in her documentary, Bombshell, the Hedy Lamarr Story. The film premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2017. It played in theaters for 3 weeks. It won awards at 6 film festivals. Approximately 140,000 people saw it. Not bad for a documentary. Not nearly enough for the story it told. The final tragedy of Hedy Lamarr's story isn't that she was forgotten. It's that she was remembered for the wrong things. Even now, decades after her breakthrough, most people who know her name know her as an actress. Beautiful, glamorous, the most gorgeous woman in Hollywood. They don't know she was an inventor. They don't know she helped win a war the Navy wouldn't let her fight. They don't know that every time they connect to Wi-Fi, they're using her idea. That's what happens when innovation comes from unexpected places. It gets credited to the people who implement it, not the people who imagine it first. Harold Beveridge got a Navy commendation in 1963 for his work on secure communication systems. Cooper Klein was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in 2008 for pioneering cellular technology. Both men built on Hedy's foundation. Both men succeeded where she couldn't, and both men, to their credit, acknowledged her contribution when asked. But acknowledgement doesn't change history. It just annotates it. There's a statue of Hedy Lamarr in Vienna now, erected in 2014 in the Döbling district where she was born. It shows her as a young woman, beautiful, elegant, looking off into the distance. The plaque mentions her films. It mentions her invention. It mentions spread spectrum, but it doesn't mention the 397 ships that sank in 1942 while her solution gathered dust. It doesn't mention Lieutenant James Morrison from Seattle. It doesn't mention the Navy engineers who knew the technology would work and couldn't get approval to build it. History likes clean narratives. Hero invents thing. Thing changes world. Hero gets credit. Hedy's story isn't clean. It's messy. It's frustrating. It's about a woman who saw a problem, solved it, offered the solution to the people who needed it most, and got told to go sell war bonds instead. It's about a technology so far ahead of its time that the people evaluating it couldn't imagine it working. It's about opportunity cost measured in lives, ships, and years. But it's also about persistence. Hedy didn't stop being an inventor when the Navy rejected her patent. She didn't stop thinking about problems and solutions. She just stopped expecting anyone to listen. And maybe that's the real lesson. Innovation doesn't require recognition. It doesn't require credit. It requires someone willing to imagine something that doesn't exist yet, and someone else, maybe decades later, willing to build it. The Navy finally acknowledged its mistake in 1997, 55 years late. Hedy received the Pioneer Award from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. She was 83. She accepted by phone. Her voice was quiet, measured, gracious. She didn't sound angry. She didn't sound vindicated. She sounded tired. When asked how it felt to finally receive recognition, she said, "It's nice, but it doesn't bring back the ships." That's the sentence that should be on her statue in Vienna. Not the dates of her films, not the list of her husbands, not even the technical description of frequency hopping. Just 8 words. It's nice, but it doesn't bring back the ships. Because that's what she cared about. Not fame, not credit, not even being right. She cared about ships not sinking, sailors not drowning, families not receiving telegrams that started with, "We regret to inform you." She solved the problem. She offered the solution. And then she had to watch the problem continue for 20 more years before anyone listened. Every technology has a story like this. Every innovation has someone who thought of it first and got ignored. Hedy's story is unique only in how visible she was, how famous, how impossible to ignore even as everyone ignored her. She was on magazine covers while her patent sat in a file cabinet. She sold war bonds while sailors died from problems she'd solved. She smiled for cameras while the Navy called her idea impractical. And she never stopped inventing. In 1945, she designed an improved traffic light. In 1953, she designed a fluorescent dog collar. In 1960, she designed a tablet that dissolved in water to create a carbonated drink. None of these inventions were patented. None were built. She'd learned her lesson. Innovation without implementation is just a hobby, and Hedy had stopped expecting anyone to implement her ideas. She died alone on a Wednesday in January in Florida with the television on. A neighbor found her 2 days later. The medical examiner estimated time of death at approximately 9:00 p.m. on January 19, 2000. She was 85 years old. Her children inherited her estate, valued at approximately $3 million from film residuals. They did not inherit any royalties from frequency-hopping technology because the patent had expired 41 years earlier. In the year 2000, the global wireless communication industry generated $687 billion in revenue. Every dollar relied on technology Hedy invented. She received nothing, not because the industry was unfair, because she was 58 years too early, because she solved a problem before the world was ready for the solution, because being right doesn't matter if nobody's listening. That's the real cost of ignoring innovation. Not just the missed opportunity, but the time lost, the years wasted, the lives that could have been saved if someone had just listened when it mattered. Hedy Lamarr handed the US Navy the solution to their deadliest problem in 1942. They filed it away. By the time they pulled it out again, the problem had killed thousands of people, sunk hundreds of ships, and prolonged a war that cost millions of lives. You can't calculate that in dollars. You can't measure it in patents. You can only measure it in the quiet question Hedy carried with her for 58 years, from the moment the Navy rejected her patent to the moment she died in Florida. What if they'd listened? We'll never know. The ships that sank can't be unsunk. The sailors who died can't be unkilled. The war that dragged on can't be shortened retroactively. All we can do is remember. Remember that innovation comes from unexpected places. Remember that the next Hedy Lamarr might be someone you're not listening to right now. Remember that too impractical often means too threatening to what we already know. And remember her last sentence, the one she said on the phone in 1997 when they finally gave her an award for changing the world. It's nice, but it doesn't bring back the ships. 8 words, that's her legacy. Not the technology, not the billions of devices, not the trillions of dollars. 8 words that say, I didn't do this for credit, I did it because people were perishing. And I'll never forgive the people who let them keep expiring when the solution was right there. Neither should we.